Hi, my name is Julius Vanderwerf from the University of New England in Armidale, and I would like to thank the organizers to invite me to talk at your conference. I'm going to talk about introducing genomic selection in the Australian sheep industry. And I'm going to talk mostly about the story that we had over the last 2 decades, which I think was quite a success story. And I would like to point out the main experiences we've had, and hopefully that gives to all of you some clues to how you can successfully introduce those genomic selection. So first, a bit of background about the Australian industry. We have quite a few breeds, and we produce two types of products. We produce wool, mostly from the merino sheep, and we produce lamb from often crossing those merino sheep with terminal breeds. So we have about 75 million sheep in Australia. The total net present value for wool is about 1.8 billion US dollars, and for meat it's a bit more. It's about 2.7 billion dollars. So, as I said, we have quite a few breeds in Australia, and there's three types of breeds. The merinos are a special type, specialized mostly in wool. We have the maternal breeds and then the terminal breeds. So within merino, we still have quite a diversity. We have very fine wool merinos that really focus on very small fibers, like less than 14 microns. And we have medium and strong wools, and those are more often used also for lamb production. The maternal breeds are often crossed with merinos, and those are the Border Leicesters, Coopert, and the composites, so they're focused on high fertility. And the terminal breeds obviously are focusing on high meat production, and the main breeds are there Paul Dorset, White Suffolk, Texel, and we have some new composites coming up as well. So those breeds are used again for wool production and for meat production. So the pure merino is usually for the fine wool production, and that's often ultra fine. That's still a business that gives a lot of high value outputs. A lot of merinos are used for dual purpose, pure merinos. So the ewes are used for producing wool and the lambs are produced for slaughter. But most of the slaughter lambs come from crossbred systems where the merinos are either crossed with maternal breeds, to what we call first cross ewes. Those are highly fertile, good maternal traits, and those are then crossed with the terminal breeds, so that gives us the three-way crosses for lamb production. But we also have merinos often crossed with the terminal breeds to give two-way crosses. So terminal breeds with purebred merinos is still a big part of the lamb production. We've had genetic improvement in Australia in a way for a long time, but more scientifically focused since the 90s, where we started measuring traits and introducing blub. And I should have said also with those breeds that the merinos tend to be more traditional, where the focus is a lot on individual selection of animals on phenotypes, so no pedigree recording and no formal trait recording. It's just selecting ewes as they stand in the paddock. And the terminal breeds have always been more interested in genetic improvement and using science and EBVs because they came basically from a purer background. So the culture there was more focusing on improvement, whereas the merinos, they came from a very wealthy background. They earned a lot of money in the 50s and 60s, and there was a very different culture with very little interest in formal genetic improvement. So the trait improvement and the measurement of traits that we started in the 90s was mostly through LambPlan, where we measured growth rates and fat and muscle in sheep. And that has really resulted in a very large genetic change. So if you compare this slide from Rob Banks, who is actually the person who introduced LambPlan, so carcass weights over 3 decades has increased by about 30%. That has also had a very large effect on the price. So other than, of course, inflation over time, the product of lamb has increased a lot, and therefore we have exported a lot more. That has introduced a much higher price. So the value of that productivity has actually increased by about sixfold. And that's really, genetic improvement has contributed a lot to it. So the point of this is really that if you have an effective breeding program, even before genomic selection, that can be very powerful and have a large effect on the industry. So then we have introduced genomic selection, and basically we started around 15 years ago, and I want to tell a bit the story of how that happened in Australia. So the first question about genomic selection is what is actually different from dairy? So I mentioned dairy because the dairy industry is obviously the most benefiting from genomic selection for many reasons, and many of those reasons are not valid in sheep. For example, in the dairy industry, they have bulls that were genotyped for milk production based on their daughters for many, many years. So they had EBVs for milk production. And we could simply genotype those bulls to create a large reference population. And therefore, there was already a reference population by just genotyping a limited numbers of bulls. So we didn't have that in sheep because all traits that we wanted to select on were actually not there. So also in dairy, there's more money by those people that want to invest in genomic selection because that is usually the large AI companies. In sheep, we wanted the breeders, so those are basically individual farmers, that do the selection to focus on genomic selection, and that could be quite a large cost relative to what they were used to so far. And the other is that, of course, in sheep we have multiple breeds, whereas in dairy it's mostly Holstein and a bit Jersey maybe, but there's many fewer breeds. And most importantly, probably, the breeding programs are different and the breeding objectives are different. In dairy, milk production is the main trait, but milk production cannot be measured on males. Male selection is the main driver of genetic progress. So in the dairy industry, we've always relied on progeny testing and very large generation intervals that gave effective genetic improvement, yet large generation intervals. So genomic selection has changed the dairy industry a lot because we could reduce the generation interval by basically selecting early on a genomic test. But the traits we selected on were not that different, certainly not initially. So you can already have a large gain in the dairy industry by just reducing generation intervals. That's not really the story in sheep. In sheep, we want to focus on traits that we cannot measure very easily, and so we have to have a different strategy. So if you look at the different breed and breed types we have in sheep, I'll list here the traits that are important. So in the merinos, we have mostly wool and a bit of growth for lamb production. And those traits are actually very easy to measure, so you don't really need genomics to change those traits. In the maternal breeds, we have early growth, and in the terminal breeds, we also have a lot of focus on growth. So those traits that are in black here are easy to measure. You don't really need genomics to give you more advantage. What genomics give you advantage of traits that you cannot easily select on, so either because they're sex limited, like the dairy traits, or they're hard to measure on breeding animals, like the carcass traits, or traits that are measured late in life, like longevity or adult wool production in sheep, reproduction, and carcass quality in the meat breeds. So in the sheep sector, we want to focus on those hard to measure traits that you cannot easily measure. And that means that you cannot easily make a reference population by genotyping historic animals that were used in the past. You need to kind of set up new animals that you want to measure for those new traits. And that is really the advantage of genomics, of course, because we don't necessarily need to measure the selection candidates. We can measure other animals of the same breed in order to genotype selection candidates to select for those traits. So the benefit in sheep for genomic selection is mainly for hard to measure traits, but it needs that you develop a reference population kind of from the start where you measure those new traits. So a brief history to give that context a bit. So up top is we had in Australia, we were lucky to have what we call the Sheep CRC, that stands for Collaborative Research Center, and that's basically a research project where the government puts in quite a lot of money if you have a big goal and many people working together. So that gave us quite a bit of investment that we could need to introduce genomic selection. So the key point of that CRC was that we started with an information nucleus, which is basically a reference population where we measured on thousands of animals the key traits. But we also measured a lot of new traits so that we would know correlations between traits that we already had and the new traits. A good example is there that we measured growth rate, but we also measured the quality of the meat and the carcass traits, because we didn't have a very good idea of the correlation between how well an animal grows and the quality of its meat. And what came out of there is that there was a quite negative and unfavorably favorable correlation between growth rate and meat quality. Meat quality measured as intramuscular fat and tenderness. In other words, if we kept going selecting for more growth, which was what we did at that time, we would slowly decrease the quality of the meat and get drier meat of lower quality. So we decided to measure those quality traits so we could select on them. And we could do that through genomics. So the first thing you need for genomic selection is, of course, that reference population and the phenotype information on all those animals. The second thing you need is genomic tools. So the first SNP chip came out in 2009, and I think the cost was close to $500. At least that's what we budgeted for at that time, so very expensive. We used it for research only, and it was a 50K chip, so 50,000 markers. So we started doing pilot projects with breeders to see if they wanted to DNA test some of their sheep using that expensive chip, and we would pay at least half of the cost, and they would they would start to generate reference populations and see if they could predict breeding animals. The other development was that we tried to get a cheaper chip. So we started to develop low-density chips of 12,000 markers, and they were quite a lot cheaper than those 50K chips at that time. We also started with parentage testing and polled horn testing, and that was important because you can easily see the result of that. Everybody likes to get parentage without going to the effort to measure the parentage, and selecting for polled sheep is quite attractive and easy to see. So that helped a bit for the industry to understand that DNA testing could help selection. So in 2012, we managed to combine that genomic information with the breeding values by blending that information, and we call those research breeding values. So we didn't call them yet official breeding values, but those were trial values to see how it worked and how people would work with them and accept them. So in 2015, we started with high-density SNP chips and sequence information, and we did a lot of GWAS because the idea was that sequence information would give you better predictions and possibly predictions across breed. In 2017, we started the first single-step genetic evaluation. That was kind of a world first, I think, for sheep, where we combined in the official runs the genomic information with the parentage. And so nowadays we have more than 1 million sheep genotyped in Australia, and it's really part of the routine running of breeding programs. So just to give you an idea, at the moment for the merinos we have already 600,000 genotyped animals, and a lot of them come in every year, at least 100,000 new genotyped animals. In maternal breeds we have 200,000, and in the terminal breeds we have about 300,000. So this creates some challenges because to put that into genetic evaluation, you kind of start with very large-scale genomic relationship matrices, and those are hard to deal with it computationally. But I won't go in too much detail, but that's going to be, of course, a challenge for the future. I will focus more on the effect of breeding programs. So I want to go again through what are the key points that determine successful implementation of genomic selection. So the first is you need a value proposition. You need a breeding objective that has traits that are not easy to improve without genomics. So those are traits that are either late measured or that cannot be measured on males, or traits that are never measured on breeding animals, like carcass traits. So if you could make more progress for those traits, that would be good value proposition. The second thing you need is you need genomic tools. So you need low-cost SNP arrays. So usually we at the moment still use the 50K SNP chip. That's still the standard tool in the industry. We've tried SCIM. You could try SCIM sequencing. You could try genotyping by sequencing. But we understand from the genotyping companies that if you have a chip, that's still the most cost-effective way to get genetic markers of a reasonable size panel. We also did quite a bit of work with sequencers and GWAS, and our conclusion was that you have limited extra accuracy in real life based on those technologies. So they could be rather costly, but the extra benefit is in a way quite small. So to show again that history, so the first SNP chip, 50K in 2009, started to go down to $150. That was still, of course, too much for an individual breeder to work with. Then we started with the 12K chip and later the 17K low-density chip. And those were about $50 and then became back to $35. Towards 2019, we could do a 50K chip for $25. And nowadays, that's kind of the same price. There's, of course, a bit of inflation. But they pay around $30 for a 50K chip. So that's the standard industry tool. And a lot of breeders, most breeders use that and genotype their flock with that 50K chip and add accuracy, especially for those new traits. So a little bit about what we've done over the years. We did a lot of GWAS with sequence information. And as you can see here, it gives much denser SNP, and this is kind of a zoom in on a Manhattan plot. You also get much better ideas of genes that are SNPs that are close to genes. So you get a good story of where genes could be that affect those traits of interest. So we did find many QTL, but we found that even if you had many QTLs identified for traits, to use them explicitly in genetic evaluation was still quite difficult. So and the effect of prediction accuracy was maybe positive, but not very large. So this slide just shows you the accuracy of genomic prediction for different methods. So the Bayesian methods put more emphasis on SNPs that have larger effects. And you can also have GBLUP methods that focus more on top SNPs, those SNPs that are close to QTL. But all of those are not that different in accuracy. Of course, those methods that use top SNPs, so those QTLs are a bit better, but not very large, not very much better. So generally, we found a small effect on accuracy, and you can still not predict across breeds. That was our hope a bit, because we had a lot of small breeds, and we hoped we could predict them from the larger breeds, but that really doesn't work even with sequence information. So our conclusion is it's better focused on developing, use your money to develop reference populations for all breeds, especially also the small breeds. So the third is indeed that we need large reference populations, and large means thousands and thousands of animals measured for new traits. Otherwise, you don't have reasonable, accurate genomic predictions. So you need a reference population for each breed. You need thousands of phenotypes for each trait that you want to predict. And you could either use historic data, like in the dairy industry. So we could focus on measuring all the rams that had breeding values for reproduction in sheep. You don't need to make new animals to measure that, because the trait was measured. It just takes a long time before you get that information on rams. But you need to make new animals for carcass traits, because those are not breeding animals, but you can make a reference population of related animals that you measure carcass traits on. And we use that concept now also for new traits such as feed intake and methane. So the third and last is that you need to have a system where you evaluate breeding values. It's nice to do genomic testing, but if you don't have a database and a system that calculates breeding values from that information, it's still not very useful. So in a way, what I mean to say here is effectively you need to have a breeding program that already exists. You need a database, you need genetic evaluation, you need EBVs, and you need indexes and breeding objectives that work with that. And then genomic selection can be easily applied into that existing system. So to show that again, here there's a pipeline for genetic evaluation that we already had before genomics. So the breeder measures phenotypes and pedigree. It sends the data to a database for phenotypes, pedigree, and that data goes to EGBU that estimates breeding values. Those breeding values are going to the breeder, and they use the breeding values, hopefully with some education, but we have now a culture that people do use breeding values. So once you have that system, it's easy to add genomic information, because the breeder can also order DNA tests with a service provider. They typically order a 50K test nowadays. And with that, we also put information of resource flocks that have data for new traits. So we measure those resource flocks for intramuscular fat, meat quality, and, for example, also methane. That all goes in a database, so we can estimate breeding values for those new traits and help the breeders to achieve that. So you do need industry tools, and you need engagement. So you need to work with breeders that they understand the value of new traits, they understand the value of using EBVs, and for many parts of the industry that is still quite a challenge. So if you ignore that engagement aspect, you still will not be successful. So what we have changed, so going back from, we used to select meat sheep for growth rate mostly, and a bit for muscle and fat, so we increased carcass weight by 38%, or by 30%, but now we have changed the direction of where we go. So with genomics, we have now selected, so on IMF, the genetic trend of intramuscular fat was going down, so the eating quality of lamb meat was going backward, but we have changed the trend, as you can see on this slide. We also have changed the trend for toughness. So if you just select on lean meat growth, you get tougher and tougher meat. So we have now also the possibilities to select for tenderness, and we have changed the genetic trend for those traits. So the next aim that we have is to use genomic selection for the sustainability traits like methane and with it feed intake. So we already have measured in the last few years 14,000 animals for methane using those portable accumulation chambers. And the idea is to introduce later this year new breeding values for methane production and develop an index of how breeders should select for methane and also for productivity at the same time. And since feed intake is an important trait that affects both productivity and efficiency as well as methane, we have also decided to measure that new trait. So the conclusion is that to introduce genomic selection, you do need an existing breeding program infrastructure where you have a pipeline of data that's being submitted and that's being evaluated to estimate breeding values. You also need to have a system and a culture where people use those EBVs in indexes to achieve the breeding goal that they have defined. And so you need to do quite a lot of work with the industry to use EBVs, and especially also new EBVs, and explain the value of those. So you need large reference populations for genomic prediction, especially, and you need one for each trait. So if you want a bit of accuracy, you need thousands of animals measured for each trait, for each breed. Otherwise, you cannot predict breeding value from genomic information. And finally, you do need genomic tools, and there's ongoing research, of course. There's lots of groups that do GWAS, that look at sequence data. Our experience is that 50K is kind of enough, and you can certainly run effective breeding programs based on that, but you never know, of course, how the future will develop. And maybe ultimately we can use more information at the gene level. At the moment, we still find that nature is complex. Individual gene effects are small and often differ between breeds. So the ability to use that is, we find, still a bit limited. But overall, we think genomic selection has an amazing effect on breeding programs. And in sheep, it's mainly to change the direction of where we are going. We can now select on traits that we could not select on before. And overall, that gives a more balanced breeding program, with more sustainability and more quality of product. So I want to thank you for your time.